to the side of the bed, and I told her that, you know, that we're not your punching bags, and
you said what?
I told her that we weren't her punching bags.
We weren't.
She kicked Remy, and she was kicking me and punching me, and I pushed her back, and I told Remy, I was like, "Yo, we're gonna take a walk."
There is a particular kind of silence that investigators learn to read. Not the silence of an empty house, not the silence of a scene before anyone has arrived, the silence that comes after. When people who do this work for a living look at what's in front of them and go very, very still. Bolton, Vermont, is a small town, home to roughly 1,300 people, the kind of place where people notice things, where a face out of place gets remembered, where something wrong has a way of eventually surfacing even when someone has gone to considerable lengths to make sure it never does. On the evening of the 18th of October 2021, Vermont State Police received a call from concerned family members reporting two-year-old Emily Ferlazzo missing. According to what they had been told, she had vanished 2 days earlier after an argument near Bolton Valley. The report began as a missing persons case. It would not stay that way for long. The first call did not come with headlines. It came with the ordinary language of concern. Someone hadn't been seen. Someone hadn't responded. Someone wasn't where they were supposed to be. That was how it started. What investigators would ultimately find, and what they would find in pieces, told a story that no missing persons report could have prepared them for, because Emily Ferlazzo hadn't simply gone somewhere. She had been erased, deliberately, methodically, by someone who knew her name, someone who had slept beside her, someone who had decided at some point between the life they had built together and the end of everything that she needed to disappear. The question was never really where Emily was. The question was, what kind of mind decides? That's the answer. Emily Ferlazzo was 22 years old. She was a licensed nursing assistant. She had also dreamed of becoming a cosmetologist, someone who could help people feel better about themselves. And according to those who knew her, who are the only people qualified to speak to who she actually was, she was compassionate, fiercely loyal, and someone who cared deeply for both people and animals. Emily grew up in New Hampshire. By the autumn of 2021, she and her husband had been living together in the Lakes region of New Hampshire, though they frequently traveled in the converted camper they had built together. Emily and Joseph did not have children. She had built a life that, from the outside, looked hopeful. She worked in healthcare. She loved singing. She loved animals. Friends and family remembered someone whose kindness seemed to come naturally, someone whose determination carried her through difficult moments, even when life became heavy. This is the part of the story that matters most. Not the end, the before. Because before any of this, before detectives and courtrooms and the language of verdicts, there was simply a woman living her life, working long shifts, planning for a future she believed she still had. Right up until the moment someone decided she shouldn't be. Before we go any further, if you're someone who needs to understand why people do the things they do, you're exactly where you should be. This is the Malice Mind. Subscribe if you haven't already. Now, back to Emily. Joseph Ferlazzo was Emily's husband. The couple had married in 2020 and were in Vermont celebrating their first wedding anniversary when Emily was killed. To the people around them, they largely appeared to be an ordinary young married couple. There was little in their public-facing life that suggested what investigators would eventually uncover. At trial, however, Emily's mother testified that there had been abuse within the marriage. No publicly documented pattern of prior police intervention or protective orders has emerged from the court record before the homicide. This pattern, a relationship whose interior looks nothing like its exterior, appears with troubling consistency in domestic homicide cases. The control isn't always audible. The danger isn't always visible. Sometimes, the most dangerous environments are the ones that look, from the outside, completely ordinary. No verified public evidence has established a financial crisis, separation, custody dispute, or divorce proceedings in the months leading up to Emily's death. The available evidence instead shows the couple traveling to Vermont to celebrate their first wedding anniversary. Emily's world, as far as anyone on the outside could see, continued, right up until it didn't. It was the evening of the 18th of October, 2021. Concerned family members contacted Vermont State Police after Joseph Ferlazzo returned home from what was supposed to be an anniversary trip without Emily. He told them she had walked away following an argument near Bolton Valley 2 days earlier and never returned. Vermont State Police became the primary investigating agency from the very beginning. At first, there was no obvious crime scene, no shattered doorway, no emergency call, no witness describing violence. There was only a young woman who was missing, and a story that investigators would soon begin testing against the evidence. Joseph Ferlazzo spoke with investigators during those first stages of the inquiry. He repeated that Emily had left on foot after an argument. His account gave investigators somewhere to begin. The investigation that followed would reconstruct with increasing precision what had happened to Emily Ferlazzo in the days before anyone outside that marriage knew to be concerned. The forensic evidence, Joseph Ferlazzo's own statements, and the physical evidence collected throughout the investigation ultimately established that Emily had been shot once in the head inside the couple's camper on or about the 16th of October, 2021. And that, in the time between her death and the moment anyone came looking for her, her husband had not called for help. He had done something else entirely. Investigators determined that Joseph Ferlazzo dismembered Emily's body after her death and attempted to dispose of her remains at multiple locations in Vermont. As the investigation progressed, physical evidence, his admissions to investigators, and the recovery of Emily's remains allowed detectives to reconstruct what had happened with increasing precision. The evidence showed a deliberate effort to conceal both the killing and its aftermath. The world Emily Ferlazzo had lived in, her routines, her relationships, her ordinary mornings, had ended. In its place was an investigation into a crime someone had worked with deliberate effort to make disappear. That effort to disappear the evidence was, as it turned out, the first of many mistakes. In the earliest stages of any homicide investigation, before the picture resolves, detectives operate in a space between evidence and theory. They gather what's there. They test it against what they know. They follow threads that sometimes lead nowhere, and they go back to the beginning when they do. They move carefully, because the cost of moving wrong is a case that never closes. The investigation was led by the Vermont State Police Bureau of Criminal Investigations, working through its Major Crime Unit. What investigators were confronted with from the earliest stages of this case was a challenge common to domestic homicides in which the perpetrator has had time after the killing. The scene had not been preserved. It had been altered. By the time detectives began reconstructing what had happened, the evidence showed that significant efforts had already been made to conceal both the killing and what followed it. This matters forensically because it means the picture investigators were trying to reconstruct was not a clean one. It was a picture of what someone had wanted them to see. Or more precisely, what someone had worked to ensure they would not see. The early investigative focus was broad but methodical. Detectives interviewed family members and Joseph Ferlazzo. Search warrants were obtained. The couple's camper was processed for forensic evidence. Digital records were collected. Search teams began looking for Emily while investigators worked to determine whether the story they had been given matched the evidence. Publicly available records do not identify a significant investigative dead end during this stage. Instead, the investigation steadily narrowed as physical evidence and Joseph's own statements increasingly contradicted his original account. Joseph Ferlazzo remained central to the investigation from the beginning because he was the last known person to see Emily alive. Investigators interviewed him repeatedly as they worked to verify the timeline he described. During those interviews, Joseph maintained that Emily had walked away after an argument near Bolton Valley. As investigators compared that account with the growing body of physical evidence, inconsistencies emerged. Those inconsistencies became increasingly significant as the investigation progressed. This moment, the conduct of the surviving partner in the hours and days immediately following a domestic homicide is forensically and psychologically one of the most revealing windows in an investigation. Not because guilt is written on anyone's face, but because investigators compare behavior, timelines, statements, and physical evidence against one another. When they fail to align, the investigation begins asking different questions. The prosecution would later point to Joseph's changing explanations, the physical evidence recovered from the camper, and his subsequent admissions as critical pieces of that evolving picture. The search for Emily, and ultimately for her remains, became a coordinated effort involving Vermont State Police investigators, forensic specialists, and search teams. Search warrants were executed, multiple locations were examined, and over the course of several days, investigators recovered physical evidence and, eventually, Emily's remains from locations identified during the investigation. In cases where a victim's remains have been intentionally concealed and dispersed, forensic work becomes painstaking by necessity. Every recovered element matters. Every piece of physical evidence must be cataloged, contextualized, and analyzed against a picture that may never be completely intact. The recovery of physical evidence and the investigation into Joseph Ferlazzo unfolded in parallel. As detectives recovered evidence, they were simultaneously testing Joseph's account, executing additional searches, and reconstructing the events of the 16th of October 2021. The weight carried by Emily's parents and loved ones during those days is something no investigative report can fully capture. The public record speaks primarily through the evidence. Their loss speaks for itself. Waiting for answers is its own kind of violence, a quiet one, the kind that doesn't make the same headlines as the crime itself, but that lasts far longer. Roughly 2 days after Emily was reported missing, the investigation reached its first decisive breakthrough. The story investigators had been given no longer fit the evidence they had collected. What investigators held at that point was an increasingly coherent picture, a timeline that was beginning to stabilize, physical evidence that contradicted the original account, and interviews that had raised more questions than they answered. They were close to something. They just hadn't found the thread that would pull it all into place. Yet, in every investigation, there is a moment, sometimes quiet, sometimes the product of weeks of methodical work, finally converging when the evidence stops pointing everywhere and starts pointing somewhere specific. In the Ferlazzo case, that moment did not come from a single dramatic discovery. It came from the accumulation of evidence that repeatedly contradicted Joseph Ferlazzo's account. Investigators compared his statements with the forensic evidence recovered from the camper, the physical evidence collected during court-authorized searches, and the timeline they were reconstructing. As those pieces came together, the original story became increasingly difficult to sustain. That evidence was obtained through search warrants, forensic examination of the camper and other locations, witness interviews, and Joseph Ferlazzo's own custodial interviews with investigators. The significance of those findings was cumulative. The physical evidence contradicted Joseph's explanation of what had happened. His statements changed as investigators confronted him with what they had uncovered. Those interviews ultimately led detectives to locations where Emily's remains were recovered, allowing investigators to connect the killing, the concealment of the crime, and the disposal of evidence into one coherent sequence, supported by both physical evidence and Joseph's own admissions. Step by step, investigators established a clear evidentiary chain. Joseph was the last known person to see Emily alive. His account was inconsistent with the forensic evidence. The camper yielded physical evidence supporting the prosecution's reconstruction of events. Joseph made admissions during questioning, and investigators recovered Emily's remains at locations connected to those admissions. Together, those findings established probable cause for arrest. On the 20th of October 2021, Joseph Ferlazzo was arrested by Vermont State Police and charged with Emily's murder. During questioning, Joseph initially maintained that Emily had walked away after an argument. As investigators confronted him with the developing evidence, his account changed, culminating in admissions that became a central part of the state's case. The case against Joseph Ferlazzo, as assembled and presented at trial, included forensic evidence, physical evidence recovered from the camper and multiple search locations, Joseph's recorded statements and admissions, expert testimony, law enforcement testimony, and testimony from family members and other witnesses that helped establish the timeline. One of the most significant moments of the trial came when Joseph Ferlazzo took the witness stand in his own defense. He testified that he shot Emily in self-defense during an argument inside the camper and claimed that his actions afterward were driven by panic. The prosecution argued that the physical evidence and Joseph's conduct after the killing were inconsistent with that account. The jury ultimately agreed. At some point in an investigation, the evidence stops being a collection of disconnected facts and becomes a story, a prosecutable story, documented, coherent, complete enough to take to a jury. That story ended in a courtroom, and the man who had built another story had constructed it layer by layer in the days after Emily died, had to sit in that courtroom and listen as the evidence dismantled it. Understanding what happened in a case like this requires evidence. Understanding why it happened and what kind of mind is capable of it requires something else. It requires a willingness to sit with the uncomfortable reality that people who commit these acts are not aberrations that fall from nowhere. In most cases, they are the product of identifiable patterns. Patterns we can name, patterns we can examine. So let's examine them. The organized offender. The first thing worth noting in the documented behavior in this case is what forensic psychologists and behavioral investigators refer to as post-offense organization. In the FBI's organized versus disorganized behavioral framework, developed through decades of analysis of violent crime, an organized offender is someone who responds to the situation with purposeful, controlled behavior rather than panicked, chaotic action. The attempt to conceal Emily's remains, if anything, demonstrates the inverse of a breakdown. This is someone who, in the immediate aftermath of killing another person, shifted into problem-solving mode. That is not a panicked response. That is a calculated one. What does that tell us? It tells us that the capacity to recognize the consequences of one's actions was present. The moral barrier to those actions, the one that exists in most human minds, simply wasn't sufficient to stop them. The dark triad and narcissistic entitlement. The dark triad, the clinical framework combining narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy, doesn't require extreme expression of all three traits to produce dangerous behavior. It requires enough of each to erode, over time, the inhibitions that most people never question because they're never tested. In domestic homicide cases, what forensic psychologists consistently document is a specific form of narcissistic entitlement, the belief at a foundational level that the relationship's continuation is contingent on the other person's compliance. That when that compliance ends through a separation, a conflict, the simple exercise of autonomy, something catastrophic has been done to the offender, not by them. When an individual's sense of self is organized around control of another person, that person's independence doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like an attack. The offender doesn't experience themselves as someone who has made choices. They experience themselves as someone who has been wronged. This cognitive framework, where another person's autonomous existence is framed as a threat rather than a right, is what allows someone to reposition murder not as something they chose, but as something that was, in some distorted internal logic, caused by the victim. Forensic professionals recognize this as externalized attribution of blame. Every bad outcome has an external source. Every act of violence has a preceding justification. The responsibility is always in the offender's accounting, somewhere else. PCLR alignment. Robert Hare's psychopathy checklist, revised the PCLR, doesn't identify monsters. It identifies a cluster of behavioral and personality traits that, in combination, significantly reduce the psychological barriers most people have to harming others. In the documented behavior of Joseph Ferlazzo, both in the conduct leading up to and in his behavior during the investigation and trial, several traits consistent with this framework are worth examining. Failure to accept responsibility, shallow or inconsistent emotional display. The absence of expected emotional responses, where a typical person would exhibit clear distress, deception, and manipulation. It is important to note, as it always must be noted in analysis of this kind, these observations are behavioral, not clinical diagnoses. The role of forensic psychology in criminal cases is not to label, but to illuminate. What we observe here aligns with traits commonly documented in perpetrators of intimate partner homicide. Whether or not a formal diagnosis exists, the behavioral pattern is what the evidence showed. What the concealment tells us. There is something forensic psychologists return to consistently in cases involving post-mortem concealment. The act of concealment is psychologically diagnostic in its own right. To conceal, you must understand. You must understand that what you did was wrong. You must understand that others will see it as wrong. And you must have the cognitive presence in that specific moment with a person you have just killed to engage in rational, strategic, self-protective behavior. That is not a person who broke down. That is a person who makes choices, a sequence of deliberate choices. And the existence of that sequence, the ability to compartmentalize, to plan, to act, is, in many ways, as revealing as the crime itself. It tells us something about who this person was before that moment. Not a monster who appeared from nowhere. A person who had always been capable of treating another human being as a problem to be managed. A word about Emily. Psychological analysis in cases like this has a gravitational pull toward the offender, because the offender's mind is, by definition, what produced the crime. Because frameworks and terminology give us the feeling of explanation. But here is what no framework explains. Emily Ferlazzo woke up on the mornings of her life and lived them. She had a particular way of. She was loved. She was a person who existed in the world and made that world slightly different from what it would have been without her. The analysis matters because understanding these patterns is how we as a society recognize them earlier, how we name the warning signs, how we perhaps prevent the next case. But Emily matters because she was a person, fully, completely, and no framework changes what was taken from her. On the 14th of December 2023, Joseph Ferlazzo was found guilty of murder in the first degree. On the 12th of January 2024, he was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Justice, in its formal sense, was served. But formal justice, the verdict, the sentence, the closing of a case file is not the same thing as restoration. There is no restoration here. There is only the fact of what was lost and the insufficient weight of accountability against it. Emily Ferlazzo had mornings. She had the small, particular texture of a life in progress. She had people who loved her. She had a future she was moving toward. One that belonged to her. All of it ended because the person closest to her chose violence. Sit with that. How many people are living right now inside a relationship where the person who is supposed to be their safest place is quietly becoming the greatest source of danger? How many Emilys are there right now whose world looks, from the outside, completely fine? Cases like Emily's don't begin on the day they end. They often begin much earlier, in patterns of control, manipulation, and escalating conflict that may not be fully visible to the people looking in from the outside. That is what this channel exists to examine, not simply the horror of these crimes, the human behavior, the investigative work, and the psychological patterns that can help us better understand them. If that thought stays with you, it should. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. And if the Malice mind is where you come to better understand the darkest corners of criminal behavior and the investigations that bring the truth to light, subscribe. We're just getting started.